Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today, we're taking a look beneath the glittering surface of the Gilded Age.
That's right.
We're not just talking about the incredible wealth. Our mission is really to dig into the powerful and, well, pretty diverse reform movements that sprang up because of it.
Exactly. The Gilded Age, it marks this fundamental pivot point in American history.
A huge shift.
Huge. You see the nation moving almost overnight, it feels like, from small workshops, craftspeople, to massive industrial factories,
Yeah.
mass production.
And that created staggering amounts of wealth, but it was all built on this idea of laissez-faire capitalism, right?
Right. Laissez-faire. And for anyone maybe not familiar, that basically means the government steps back, let the market run itself, minimal interference, no real regulation to speak of.
Okay, so what did that actually mean for people on the ground? The human cost of just letting the market run wild?
Well, the consequences were, frankly, devastating for the working class.
Yep.
You had these titans of industry getting incredibly rich, unimaginable fortunes concentrated in just a tiny slice of the population.
While everyone else...
Workers got paid barely enough to survive, and the conditions, they were brutal. Dangerous factories, totally unregulated, the typical workday. 12, sometimes 14 hours long.
Wow.
So this huge economic boom, it really came at the price of just misery for millions of people.
So they weren't just poor, it sounds like. They were seen as almost disposable parts in this big machine.
That's a good way to put it.
The problem wasn't that the country lacked wealth, it was how it was all being distributed, or not
Distributed.
precisely.
Yeah.
And that contradiction, this incredible national wealth right alongside terrible poverty, it created this moral and political boiling point. Demands for change were just bound to happen.
Makes sense.
So in this deep dive, we're going to look at the alternative ideas people came up with. The critics, the visionaries tackling this huge problem from all sorts of angles: economic, political, moral, social.
Okay, let's dive in. Maybe start where the system seemed most broken, the economy itself. Let's look at some of those really radical critiques aimed at restructuring how wealth even worked. And that brings us straight to Henry George. He was an economist, and he saw that central paradox very clearly. How could a nation this rich have so much poverty? It just didn't make sense to him.
What was his take on it?
He argued that wealth came from labor, from capital, sure, but land was different, it's fixed. His big idea, the really revolutionary one, was the single tax.
The single tax, just on land, right? Not like a general property tax we might think of today.
Exactly.
Go on.
It wasn't about taxing buildings or improvements people made. It targeted what he called the unearned increment.
Unearned increment.
Yeah, George's point was this. Landowners just sitting on property watched its value shoot up. Why? Because the community grew around it. New railroads came in. More people moved there. The city invested in infrastructure. The owner didn't do anything to earn that increased value.
Oh, okay, I see.
So he saw that unearned wealth, that rent, as the root of inequality. His solution: tax only that land value, maybe at 100%. He thought you could fund the government entirely this way, redistribute wealth, and importantly, not discourage actual work or building things.
Wow. That's a pretty clean, bold idea. Did it catch on?
Immensely popular. It became a huge populist cause. Just shows how an economic theory can really resonate.
Fascinating. But not everyone used economic theory to make their point. Some turned to, well, storytelling, fiction, which brings us to Edward Bellamy.
Right, Bellamy's novel, Looking Backward, published in 1888, it became this absolute phenomenon, one of the best-selling books of the whole era. And why? Because it offered a vision of a totally different world.
What was the story?
It's about a guy from Boston who falls asleep in 1887, some kind of hypnotic sleep, and wakes up in the year 2000.
Okay.
And he finds America completely transformed. Capitalism, gone, abolished.
Gone. Replaced with what? What did this future look like?
Bellamy described it as this peaceful, efficient, socialist utopia. The state owned everything, all the factories, farms, transportation. Everyone worked in these sort of industrial armies, managed collectively.
Industrial army.
Yeah, citizenship was basically your job. But everyone's needs, housing, food, education, were completely taken care of by the collective. The book's power was that it made socialism seem not just possible, but like rational, orderly, desirable, a smooth transition, not chaos.
So that kind of utopian idea probably fueled the actual political movements pushing for socialism, didn't it? People wanting community ownership, regulation.
Absolutely. It fed right into the rise of organized socialist politics. And maybe the most famous voice of that movement was Eugene V. Debs.
Debs, the labor leader.
That's him. Debs really lived the struggle. He started as a labor organizer, founded the American Railway Union, a really powerful union at the time.
Right.
But after seeing strike after strike get crushed, often with government help on the side of the companies, the Pullman strike is the big example. He became completely convinced. He decided industrial capitalism itself was just fundamentally exploitative. It couldn't be fixed with small tweaks.
So his answer was more radical. Full-on political organization.
Yes. He pushed for collective ownership of the means of production. He was a key figure in founding the Socialist Party of America back in 1901.
And he ran for president, what, 5 times?
He did. Multiple times. He knew he probably wouldn't win, but the campaigns were platforms. Huge platforms to educate people, to build a mass movement aimed at really systemic, fundamental change.
It's striking, the range of responses. You've got George with his economic fix, Bellamy with the utopian dream, Debs trying to build political power, all demanding huge changes.
Yeah, whole spectrum.
But if the political system, the courts, weren't listening to Debs, where else could people turn? I imagine when poverty and inequality are that stark, it starts to feel like a spiritual crisis, too.
That's a really important point. When the state seems unresponsive, people often look to moral institutions. And this is exactly when we see the rise of the social gospel movement.
The social gospel.
Yeah, religious leaders, mostly Protestant ministers at first, started saying, wait a minute, focusing only on saving individual souls isn't enough. They argued they had a moral duty, a Christian duty, to try and redeem society itself.
So applying Christian ethics directly to, like, the factory floor, to the slums.
Precisely. The core argument was that social and economic injustice, poverty, exploitation, these were sins, and the church had to confront them head on. For a lot of middle-class churchgoers, this really reframed their faith. It wasn't just about personal piety anymore. It meant actively fighting poverty and inequality.
Can you give us an example, a key figure?
Well, Washington Gladden was an early, very influential voice. He was a Congregationalist minister who basically argued that all economic life, all political life had to answer to Christian morality. He was telling businessmen, your bottom line has moral weight.
And was this just a white middle-class thing, or did it reach other communities?
Oh, definitely not just white churches. That's crucial. Figures like Reverdy Ransom, a leading African-American minister in the AME Church, powerfully connected the social gospel to the fight for racial justice.
How so?
Ransom insisted that Christianity demanded you fight both economic exploitation and racial inequality. For African Americans facing discrimination and poverty, these struggles were obviously intertwined. He made that link explicit.
And did these ideas translate into actual action, policy changes?
They did, often through reformers who took that moral energy and applied it. Florence Kelley is a great example.
Kelly, she worked on child labor, right?
Yes, and much more. She used the moral outrage fueled by the social gospel to push relentlessly for concrete reforms, laws against child labor, minimum wage laws, better, safer working conditions. She framed these not as economic debates, but as moral imperatives.
That idea of making the problems visible, unavoidable, it connects to another key trend, doesn't it? The rise of investigative journalism, what they called muckraking.
Absolutely, social expose. Because it's one thing to hear a sermon about poverty, but it's something else entirely to see it.
And that's where Jacob Riis comes in.
Jacob Riis.
Yeah.
He was a Danish immigrant, a journalist, and crucially, a photographer. His work basically dragged the horrifying reality of New York City's tenements out into the light.
His book, How the Other Half Lives.
That's the one, from 1890. He used this new technology, flash photography, to capture images inside dark, crowded tenement buildings, places the middle and upper classes never went, never saw.
It's hard for us to maybe grasp how shocking those photos must have been then, for people living comfortable lives just blocks away.
Exactly. It was undeniable proof. Proof of the squalor, the disease, the sheer human misery that the industrial system was built on, or at least tolerated. You couldn't ignore it anymore.
And did it work? Did it spark change?
It absolutely did. Riis's book and photos created this huge public outcry. It directly led to campaigns for housing reform, for better sanitation, parks, schools in those neighborhoods. It proved that showing people the truth, especially visually, could be an incredibly powerful tool for forcing change.
Okay, so we've seen economic theories, political movements, moral awakenings, investigative exposés, but a huge piece of the puzzle, especially in terms of organized action, was women, wasn't it?
Absolutely central. Women were often the driving force behind the most sustained, effective grassroots reform efforts. They built massive organizations, leveraged education, lobbied relentlessly, often linking their own fight for equality to these broader justice movements.
Because they didn't have the vote yet, for the most part. They had to organize differently.
Precisely. They had to build power outside the formal political system. Take the temperance movement, for example.
Right, the fight against alcohol.
Reformers saw alcohol abuse not just as a personal moral failing, but as a major social and economic problem. They argued specifically that working-class men spending wages on drink was a direct cause of poverty, domestic violence, and family instability.
And the main engine for this was the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union.
Yes, the WCTU, founded back in 1874. And you have to understand the scale here. By the late 1890s, it had something like 500,000 members.
500,000? That's enormous.
Huge. It was one of the largest, most powerful women's organizations in the country. And a lot of that influence was down to its longtime president, Frances Willard.
Willard. She had a broader vision than just banning alcohol, didn't she?
She absolutely did. Willard famously advocated a do-everything policy for the WCTU. She saw temperance as linked to everything else: workers' rights, public health, sanitation, and critically, women's suffrage.
How does she connect suffrage to temperance?
Her argument was pragmatic. She called it the home protection ballot. Women needed the vote, she argued, to protect their homes and families by enacting moral reforms like prohibition. It was this really smart, comprehensive platform for social change, all led by women.
So Willard provided the organizing genius, but then you had figures like Carrie Nation providing the memorable moments.
Yes, Carrie Nation. She represents the more militant, direct action wing of the movement, famous for literally marching into saloons, often with followers, and physically smashing barrels of liquor with a hatchet.
I love her quote about herself.
Yeah, she called herself a bulldog running along at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like.
That's quite an image.
It is. And while maybe controversial even then, that kind of confrontational style kept the issue of alcohol and its social costs right in the public eye. You couldn't ignore it.
Of course, for many women activists, the ultimate prize was political power itself, the right to vote. That fight really ramped up during this era, too.
It certainly did. You see, the founding of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAJOLIA, in 1890, led by veterans like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony.
And they campaigned tirelessly, state by state.
Tirelessly. It was a long, hard slog. But that relentless pressure eventually led to the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women's suffrage nationally.
But it's important to remember, I think, that for many women, especially women of color, suffrage was tied up with other urgent civil rights battles.
That's absolutely essential context. You look at someone like Mary Church Terrell. She was one of the first African-American women to get a college degree. A dedicated suffragist, yes, but her activism was much broader.
What else was she involved in?
She co-founded the National Association of Colored Women, the NACW. Their motto was, "Lifting as we climb." They fought explicitly for both racial uplift and gender equality, recognizing that Black women faced this double burden of racism and sexism.
And we should also bring in the perspective of indigenous women like Zitkala Shah.
Yes, Zitkala Shah offers such a critical viewpoint. She was a Yankton, Dakota writer, a musician, an activist. She fought fiercely to preserve Native American culture against the government's really brutal assimilation policies.
And she saw suffrage as part of that fight?
Exactly. For her, women's suffrage wasn't some separate issue. It was part of the larger struggle for Native rights, for sovereignty, for resisting cultural erasure. A very different perspective than, say, Willard's or Anthony's.
Wow. Okay, so one more key area of women's leadership we have to touch on. The settlement houses. Jane Addams and Hull House.
Ah, Jane Addams and Hull House in Chicago. Yeah. These settlement houses were really ingenious.
How did they work? What did they do?
On the surface, there were community centers in poor immigrant neighborhoods. They provided vital social services, daycare, English classes, healthcare clinics, art programs, things people desperately needed.
But they were more than just charity operations.
Oh, much more. They were, in effect, laboratories for social reform. Addams and the other women running them, mostly college-educated women, lived in the community. They gathered data on poverty, on working conditions, on health. They tested out solutions.
And they became hubs for activism.
Absolutely. They were places where women built powerful networks, developed leadership skills, and pushed for legislative change based on their firsthand experience. They were basically training grounds for a whole generation of female reformers and social scientists.
Okay, so if we try to pull all these different threads together, all these movements, these individuals, What's the big takeaway about the response to the Gilded Age?
I think the key insight is just how varied the response was. It wasn't one single reform movement with one goal.
Yeah.
It was this whole spectrum of reactions bubbling up simultaneously.
Right.
You had the really radical economic thinkers like George and Bellamy saying, let's scrap the system or tax it fundamentally differently. You had the moral crusaders of the social gospel and muckrakers like Rees saying, this is morally wrong, look at the suffering.
And then the organizer.
And then the incredibly organized, persistent social action, largely driven by women, through groups like the WCTU, Now Levasea, the settlement houses, each tackling pieces of the problem.
And looking back, you can really see how these movements, all of them together, laid the groundwork for so many things we take for granted now, can't you? Ideas about social responsibility, government regulation, worker protections.
Absolutely. They fundamentally shifted the national conversation. They forced Americans to grapple with what justice and fairness meant in this new industrial age. Without that sustained pressure from so many different directions, who knows how long unchecked laissez-faire might have continued.
They really set the stage for the progressive era and beyond. The debates they started, in many ways, we're still having them today. It just showed that huge systemic problems often need a whole range of solutions coming from everywhere.
Well put, it required that multifaceted approach.
So here's something for you, our listener, to maybe think about after this deep dive wraps up. When you consider these different approaches we've discussed, the kind of pure economic restructuring Henry George pushed for, or the sweeping utopian vision Edward Bellamy offered, versus the more on-the-ground moral and social action of the social gospel folks, or the WCTU, which of those strategies do you think proved most effective, most immediately effective, at actually forcing some kind of change, some kind of regulation onto that exploitative Gilded Age system? Which tool made the biggest dent right away? Something to mull over.